Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. My name is Eduardo, and I'm a bus driver for Greyhound Lines. I've been driving since the early 2000s. I want to share a story about something that happened to me that still makes me reflect to this day. I'm not very good at telling stories, but I'll do my best. A few years ago, I was driving the route from Seattle to Denver, passing through many highways covered in fog at night. Personally, I prefer driving at night since there's usually little traffic. That day I left as usual, crossed through Oregon, and as I climbed toward the mountain passes, I encountered very dense fog, not imagining what I would encounter further ahead. After leaving the mountain region toward the interstate to Colorado, I followed my usual route, picking up passengers and loading the bus as customary. However, something caught my attention. An elderly woman who seemed quite out of the ordinary, with a large build and dressed in typical ranch clothing. I greeted her normally as we climbed the dangerous curves. I realized I needed to go very slowly because, as I had anticipated, the fog was extremely dense that night. I drove with great caution. What seemed really strange to me was that since I left the mountain area, I began to feel unusual fatigue. This wasn't normal for me since I'm used to long hours of driving, and sleepiness usually only appears when I'm close to Denver. I continued along the road, but soon I felt a chill. It was as if someone was next to me, which made me shudder. But no matter how much I looked, I saw nothing and no one. That's when I remembered the mysterious, elderly woman. This made me scared again. I continued my journey fearfully. When I arrived in Denver and passengers began to get off, the last to leave was precisely that mysterious, elderly woman. When I handed her her luggage, she told me, "You got scared, didn't you?" This surprised me, and I asked. "When, ma'am," she responded, "last night at dawn he tried to get on, but I came with you. Don't worry, I left something to protect you. When you see another black fog, just say out loud, 'You don't enter here.'" Since then, I had never told this to anyone until recently, when a photo of a ghost that got on with a trucker in that same area went viral. I don't know how that woman knew what happened, but I've also never seen anything like it again. What I do know is that when I travel at night, sometimes I feel like someone is accompanying me in the cabin, but I no longer feel fear. On some trips, I notice this presence. On others, I don't. It only appears when I feel I'm in danger. I have more stories, but I hope you enjoyed this one. Even knowing it's hard to believe, this is how things happened. The first strange dream I had, when I thought I was just experiencing sleep paralysis, happened in my childhood. I remember it clearly because at that time, before anyone explained to me what was behind it, and told me there was no reason to be scared, these episodes seemed simply terrifying. That particular night, I fell asleep to the sound of my parents arguing. Although they never resorted to physical violence, I remember that days before. My mother had thrown one of my toys at my father during a heated argument. She held the object with increasing force as the discussion heated up. It was a small pony. My father knew exactly where to go with his cruel words, always finding the right spot to hurt and destabilize her. He would say that she had given up everything to be a mother and housewife, and that she couldn't even do that right, that she would never be enough. You can imagine the kind of thing. The next image I have is of him ducking as my toy flew over his head. Then I saw my mother's eyes filled with intense rage that I had never witnessed before. I remember that moment of silence when neither dared to say anything. And although I was in shock and terrified, I decided to do something. I started crying and screaming. I wasn't really in the mood to cry, but it was the only thing that occurred to me to divert attention and prevent the fight from getting worse. And at that moment, it worked. It worked, but I knew I couldn't do this every time. I felt afraid that the situation would cross a dangerous line. I was tired, feeling increasingly exhausted. My brother had already left home, moved to live with our relatives in another state to study at university. I'm absolutely certain, although he never admitted it, that he chose to study a program that didn't exist in our city, just so he could leave. Here in America, unlike some other countries, it's common for children to leave home for college, but he had options closer to home and chose not to take them. He managed to escape, leaving behind this burden that was now mine and me. A child worried every day, who didn't deserve to carry this weight. I got tired of repeatedly hearing that they were together just because of me, just because they loved me. It took me a long time to forgive myself for this, because deep down I thought all that unhappiness they showed every day was my fault. I felt it was my responsibility that they were still together. And now, at that moment, I also felt it was my duty to ensure they didn't kill each other. There was one night, after a full day of fights that started early in the morning, when I simply decided to go to bed and try to sleep. But their voices arguing in the living room echoed through the rooms, and then the fight extended to their bedroom. At some point, I heard my mother leave to sleep in the living room, but soon after, my father went after her because they still hadn't finished. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house, going from the living room to the bedroom, passing right in front of my door. Then I heard the back and forth movement several times. Finally, I opened my eyes, but something was wrong. I couldn't move. That's when I realized my bedroom door was open, and I saw that thing walking back and forth while my parents fought, completely oblivious to that presence. It was like a stain of burnt red, almost black. I could barely see with my eyes full of tears. I tried to concentrate, to focus on that figure. The thing passed by again, and this time it stopped right in front of my door. It realized I had seen it. It stood there staring at me. As the seconds passed, that figure began to take shape. I don't know if it was changing, or if my eyes and brain were trying to make sense of what I was seeing, creating an image I could recognize. What was outside my room was red in color with horns, like the devil from lottery cards. It held its own tail in its hands and wouldn't stop staring at me. It didn't smile, but I felt a mocking air coming from it. I didn't need to see it smile to feel that. It continued walking back and forth in the hallway, over and over again, while I remained there motionless, crying from fear, crying from rage. The dreams became more sporadic, but looking back, I realized that many of them happened at very important moments in my life. both good and bad, especially during the bad moments. The few deaths that occurred in my family were terrible, and all of them were preceded by one of these dreams. I was 17 when I woke up again at 3 in the morning. I didn't need to look at the clock, I just knew. It was always like that. My room was completely dark, although I always left a small lamp on since darkness scared me. But somehow the light had been turned off. The switch was hard, and there was no way this could have happened due to an electrical problem. I woke up but couldn't open my eyes completely or move. Gradually, I began to wake up in quotes, because I started to forget the dream I was having as my consciousness returned. I tried to look around the room, but my body remained completely paralyzed, totally rigid. That's when I saw something in the corner of the room, sitting. There was no chair there, but whatever it was seemed to be sitting on one. The room was very dark, but my eyes began to adjust, and gradually I began to recognize a shape. It looked like a woman sitting, wearing a long skirt composed of several layers of fabric. Her hands rested on her knees, and she wore sleeves with ruffles. The most frightening thing, she was smiling. I tried not to look, tried to sleep, but the fear I felt was enormous. Her presence deeply bothered me, although I wanted to believe it was just a creation of my imagination. I opened my eyes again. Now she was looking at me. Her head remained turned forward, but her eyes, completely distorted, stared at me sideways, still with that horrible smile on her face. Every time I opened my eyes, there she was. I stayed like this for an hour, until I heard my father get up much earlier than usual. He showered, got dressed, and left the house. He didn't come to say goodbye to me. I just heard the sound of the car being started with some difficulty in that early morning, and he left. That afternoon, there was an event at my father's work, right after lunch. It was a kind of celebration, meeting on the terrace of the building where his offices were. My father was there, interacting with everyone as usual. He talked, laughed, joked with colleagues. Then suddenly, he put his drink on the table, wiped his hands with a napkin, turned around, and walked toward the edge of the terrace. We received the call an hour later. The strangest thing is that in the days before, there were no fights at home. He didn't scold me, and nothing, absolutely nothing, indicated that something like this was about to happen. Not for a second did it cross my mind that my father could do something to hurt himself. In recent weeks, it even seemed like there was a certain peace at home. Later, my mother said that maybe that was just the eye of the hurricane. I had one more of those dreams the following night, a night that changed my life forever. I was still living with my mother, but she wasn't home. She was celebrating what I believe was her best friend's 25th wedding anniversary. She had insisted I go, saying it would be good for me, that Mariana, her friend's daughter, wanted to reconnect with me, to be friends again like when we were children. But honestly, people like that give me immense laziness, so I decided to stay home. When 3 in the morning came, I opened my eyes. I heard my mother arriving. She tiptoed to my bedroom door and opened it. I pretended to be asleep to avoid talking, but I heard when she entered and strangely crawled under my bed. "I'm here, here underneath. Don't see me, don't see me, don't see me, please." The voice was my mother's, but at the same time it seemed different. I had never felt anything like this before. I was very scared, but the way she said that made me feel like I needed to see. I needed to look under the bed. There was something they were trying to hide from me, something I had to see. Then I realized that suddenly I could move. I only managed to lean slightly out of the bed, but I didn't have the courage to get down. I ended up falling asleep, as always happened in these situations, never having the courage to run away. The next morning, we received a call. It was my brother's girlfriend. She told us that at dawn, they were at a party. He went out to smoke, and then a black car with tinted windows approached. Neither she nor anyone who was nearby could see who was inside. The car stopped next to him. Someone rolled down the window and said something. My brother looked at the person, then looked at his girlfriend, waved, and got in the car. That was the last time she saw him. She had been without news from him for hours, so she decided to call us to see if we had any idea who it could be. But we didn't know anything. We had no idea who had come to get him. It had been several years since we had seen him, and we never saw him again. No one knew anything more about him or that car. It was as if he had disappeared from the face of the earth. And maybe I don't talk about this with the pain I should, I know. But the age difference between us meant we were never very close. After he left the city, he returned few times. He distanced himself especially after our father's death. I always had the feeling that he blamed us, as if he believed that had been our responsibility. The Vanished Voices, a small town's hidden crisis that changed everything. The crimson and amber lights of Officer Diana Brooks's patrol car pierced through the thick morning mist blanketing Route 17. At 10:23 in the morning, this desolate stretch of highway should have been empty, save for the occasional logging truck heading to the lumber mill. Instead, her headlights illuminated a small silhouette standing perfectly still on the gravel shoulder. One bare foot touching the yellow center line. Diana slammed her brakes, her heart racing as she took in the scene before her. "Dear God," she whispered, stepping out of her vehicle and approaching cautiously. The child couldn't have been more than 9 years old. His torn Superman pajamas hung loosely on his thin frame, no shoes protecting his feet from the cold October morning. But it was his eyes that stopped Diana cold, hollow, and distant, as if they had witnessed something no child should ever see. "Hey there, buddy," she said gently, kneeling to his level. "What are you doing out here all by yourself? Where's your family?" Her flashlight revealed streaks of dirt across his pale cheeks and hands that trembled slightly in the morning chill. The boy's lips parted, but at first, no sound emerged. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke 3 words that would forever change the quiet town of Millbrook, Vermont. "They're still down there." Within 20 minutes, Sheriff David Chen arrived, followed by 3 deputies. By noon, the entire Millbrook Police Department had mobilized. Before evening fell, the National Guard had established checkpoints on every road leading into the town. Those 3 simple words had triggered a chain of events that would expose secrets buried deep beneath the earth and shake the very foundation of their community. Millbrook, Vermont, had once prospered from the rich deposits of copper and silver that snaked through the mountains surrounding the valley. For over a century, the mines had provided steady employment and modest wealth to generations of families. The town square still showcased its Victorian-era courthouse, with gleaming white columns, and an ornate clock tower that chimed every hour. But the surrounding businesses told a different story. For lease, signs dotted empty storefronts, plywood-covered broken windows, and only a handful of determined shop owners remained, sustained by little more than stubborn loyalty to a place that progress seemed determined to abandon. It was in this forgotten corner of New England that Marcus Williams had appeared like an apparition on Route 17. The boy lived with his grandmother, Rose Williams, in a weathered two-story colonial on Oak Street that had sheltered 4 generations of the Williams family. Rose had been Marcus's guardian since he was 4, after his parents perished in a devastating house fire that claimed 3 other families in their apartment complex. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Sheriff Chen as he sat at his cluttered desk, studying the missing person report Rose had filed 4 days earlier. Sheriff Chen, known as Dave to everyone except criminals and journalists, had spent his entire 55 years in Millbrook. The previous 12 years, as sheriff, had carved permanent worry lines around his brown eyes and streaked gray through his once jet-black hair. Since losing his husband to a heart attack 3 years ago, the job had become his anchor, his reason for getting up each morning. He thought he knew every family's struggles, every hidden pain, every secret that Millbrook harbored. Until now, he had believed that knowledge made him a good sheriff. Dr. Amanda Foster had returned to her hometown only 8 months ago, after a distinguished 15-year career at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. A difficult divorce had driven her back to familiar territory, though the Millbrook she found bore little resemblance to the thriving community she had left 2 decades earlier. Her child psychology practice occupied a modest office above the old pharmacy, where she now sat across from Marcus Williams, watching him stare at the blank sheet of paper before him, as if it contained answers he couldn't yet voice. Deputy Michael Torres paced outside the interview room, his athletic frame radiating barely contained energy. At 32, he viewed Millbrook as a stepping stone to bigger opportunities, perhaps with the state police or even the FBI. This case, whatever it ultimately revealed, could be his ticket to advancement if he handled it correctly. Meanwhile, Mayor Patricia Sullivan was already in full damage control mode, making urgent calls from her mahogany-paneled office. Tourism from the spectacular fall foliage was Millbrook's last remaining source of significant revenue. Whatever was happening with the Williams boy couldn't be allowed to tarnish that carefully cultivated image. Not if the town was to survive another harsh winter. Sheriff Chen knocked softly on Dr. Foster's office door. Through the frosted glass, he could see her silhouette hunched over paperwork, her shoulders tense with concentration. 5 days had passed since Marcus Williams appeared on Route 17, and the boy had spoken exactly 11 words since those first 3 that had thrown their quiet community into turmoil. "Come in, Dave," Dr. Foster called, and the sheriff entered, removing his hat out of habit. The child psychologist looked exhausted, dark circles forming beneath her intelligent green eyes, a testament to the long hours she'd been spending with Marcus. "Any progress?" Chen asked, settling into the chair across from her desk, its leather worn smooth by years of worried parents and concerned officials. "Some," Amanda replied cautiously, sliding a manila folder toward him. "But you're not going to like what I'm seeing." Inside the folder were crayon drawings, crude but unmistakably deliberate. Each depicted the same scene with slight variations. dark tunnels stretching into blackness, stick figures huddled in corners, and always, prominently featured, what appeared to be 7 distinct human forms grouped together in a larger space. Underground, Chen muttered, studying the images with growing unease. Could be anywhere around here. Half this county sits on old mining tunnels. He draws these for hours, Amanda explained, leaning back in her chair. Same scene over and over, with obsessive attention to the number of figures. Classic repetitive behavior following severe trauma. She gestured toward the window, where they could see the growing media presence. 2 local news vans had multiplied to 6, including crews from Boston and Burlington. The phrase, "they're still down there," had captured public imagination, spawning wild theories and bringing curious onlookers to Millbrook's normally tranquil streets. "Rose is beside herself," Chen said, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "Says Marcus was acting strange for weeks before he disappeared. Sneaking food from the pantry, hoarding water bottles, flashlight batteries. She thought it was just typical kid behavior, maybe building a fort in the woods." Dr. Foster's brow furrowed as she processed this information. He was stockpiling supplies, either for himself or for others. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. The door burst open as Deputy Torres entered without his usual courtesy knock. "Sheriff, we've got something," he announced, slightly out of breath. Search team found a backpack buried under some leaves about half a mile into the forest behind the Williams property. Rose confirmed it's Marcus's. Chen stood quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. Contents: empty food wrappers, 3 water bottles, a small first aid kit, and this. Torres handed over a composition notebook, its pages water-stained but still legible. Childish handwriting marked dates and times alongside tally marks arranged in groups of 7. He was keeping track of something, Sheriff, or someone. Or 7 someones, Chen said grimly, flipping through the pages. Each entry showed the same pattern, a date, a time, and exactly 7 tally marks. The entries spanned nearly 2 months, ending abruptly 4 days ago. That afternoon, Rose Williams sat trembling in the sheriff's office, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. At 73, she had weathered many storms in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this nightmare. "I should have known something was seriously wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "He would disappear for hours after school. I thought he was just being a normal boy, exploring, playing in the woods like his father used to do." She paused, struggling with the weight of guilt. "My husband Thomas worked those mines for 35 years before they closed. He used to take Marcus on walks through the old mining areas, telling him stories about life underground, about how the miners looked out for each other." A sharp knock at the door interrupted her confession. Mayor Sullivan entered without waiting for permission, her usual politician's smile replaced by an expression of barely controlled panic. "Dave, we need to talk privately," she said, her voice tight with urgency. In the hallway, Sullivan's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "The town council is extremely concerned about where this investigation is heading. If word gets out that we have people missing or worse in those old tunnels, we can kiss our fall tourism season goodbye. That represents 60% of our annual revenue." Chen felt his face harden, a familiar anger rising in his chest. "With all due respect, Patricia, I have a traumatized 9-year-old boy and potentially 7 other people in serious danger. Your tourism revenue will have to wait." You don't understand the bigger picture here, Dave, Sullivan pressed. If this town loses its tourism income, we won't be able to afford basic services. No police department, no fire department, no emergency medical services. How does that help anyone? Back in Dr. Foster's office, Marcus Williams finally broke his pattern of repetitive drawing. When shown the notebook recovered from his backpack, he looked directly at the psychologist for the first time since their sessions began. His small finger pointed to a particular entry, and in a voice rusty from disuse, he whispered, "Time's running out." "The singing chamber," Marcus said, his voice barely audible in the interview room. Dr. Foster leaned forward, careful to maintain a neutral expression despite the surge of excitement she felt. After days of near silence, Marcus Williams had finally offered something substantial. "Can you tell me more about this singing chamber, Marcus?" she asked gently, sliding a fresh sheet of paper toward him along with his favorite blue crayon. The boy's small fingers gripped the crayon tightly, sketching what appeared to be a circular room with high, arched ceilings. "Grandpa Thomas called it that," he explained, his voice growing slightly stronger. "He said the old miners would gather there during their breaks, because the echoes made their voices sound like angels singing hymns." Sheriff Chen paced outside, his cell phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with the state emergency response team. When Dr. Foster emerged with the new drawing, his weathered face lit up with recognition. "The cathedral chamber," he said, taking the paper with careful hands. "That's what the old-timers always called it. It's a natural limestone cavern they discovered while digging the northern shaft of the Copper Mountain mine. Used it as a rest area because of the natural ventilation and acoustic properties." He tapped the drawing thoughtfully. "It's part of the old Mountain View mining complex, been sealed up for almost 30 years now." Within 2 hours, Chen had assembled his deputies in the conference room. Yellowed maps of the historical mining network covered every available surface, marked with coffee stains and penciled notes from decades of use. Harold Thompson, the town's unofficial historian and former mine engineer, traced his gnarled fingers along the tunnel layouts with the reverence of someone who had spent half his life in those dark passages. "The main entrance collapsed back in '91, Harold explained, circling an area on the central map. "But there were at least 8 auxiliary entrances scattered throughout these hills." He adjusted his thick glasses, squinting at the faded markings. Safety regulations required multiple exit routes. Most were properly sealed when the mines closed, but a few of the smaller ones might still be accessible if you know exactly where to look. Deputy Torres pointed to a spot near where Marcus had been found. "What about this area? The old ventilation shaft near Copper Creek." Harold leaned closer, studying the topographical details. "Possibly. That section had some of the most stable engineering, built on granite bedrock instead of shale. The tunnels there were designed to last." Chen's radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission. He listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. "They found something at the Williams property," he announced. "Multiple sets of footprints leading into the forest. Small ones matching Marcus's sneakers, but also larger adult prints. At least 6 different shoe patterns." News of this discovery spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By mid-afternoon, the town hall was packed beyond capacity, with concerned citizens demanding answers and explanations. Mayor Sullivan stood at the podium. perspiration beading on her forehead, despite the cool autumn air flowing through the open windows. I want to assure everyone that Sheriff Chen and his dedicated team are pursuing every possible lead, Sullivan said, her voice straining to project confidence over the growing murmur of the crowd. There is currently no evidence of any immediate danger to our community. Then why are there National Guard soldiers at every road leading into town? Shouted someone from the back of the packed room. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly like a wave. Purely as a precautionary measure, Sullivan insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. What about those old mines? Interrupted Martha Jenkins, who had run the local diner for 40 years and knew every piece of town gossip. My father worked in those tunnels for 25 years. He always said they were death traps just waiting to happen, even when they were operational. The mayor's face flushed bright red. The mines have been officially sealed for decades. There is absolutely no connection between. My nephew saw search teams heading toward the North Ridge this morning, called out another voice from the crowd. That's exactly where the old Mountain View entrance used to be. Sullivan shot a desperate look toward Sheriff Chen, who stood at the back of the room with the resigned expression of someone who knew the truth could no longer be contained. With a heavy sigh, the sheriff moved to the front of the packed room. Folks, he began, his deep voice instantly quieting the chaos, I'm not going to lie to you or sugarcoat the situation. We have reason to believe there may be people in serious danger somewhere within the old mining system. Marcus Williams has given us compelling evidence to support this theory, and we are investigating all possibilities with the full resources at our disposal. He held up his hand as voices rose again in alarm. But spreading panic and wild speculation won't help anyone, including those who may need our help. What we desperately need right now are volunteers who know this terrain intimately. People who remember the old days, who understand how these tunnels connect. The meeting immediately dissolved into chaos as Mayor Sullivan tried unsuccessfully to regain control of the situation. Outside the town hall, Dr. Foster found Marcus sitting quietly on the front steps with his grandmother. The boy was staring intently at the distant hills, where the mine entrances lay, hidden among thick stands of pine and maple trees, their autumn colors brilliant in the afternoon sunlight. Marcus, she said gently, settling beside him on the cool stone steps. You've been incredibly brave in helping us understand what's happening. Can you tell me how many people are waiting down there? The boy's eyes remained fixed on the hills, but his voice was clear and certain. 7, he whispered. But Jenny's getting really sick now. She needs medicine. Rose gasped beside him, her hand flying to her mouth. Jenny Morrison. She disappeared from the homeless shelter in Burlington 3 months ago. They thought she'd moved on to another city. Dr. Foster felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm afternoon sun. Marcus, how do you know Jenny is sick? I found them when I was exploring the places Grandpa Thomas showed me, he said simply, his young voice carrying a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made his words even more heartbreaking. They got trapped when the ceiling fell down. I promised I would bring help, and I've been bringing them food and water. But Jenny has a bad cough that won't go away. Back inside the town hall, the meeting had fractured into multiple heated arguments. One faction, led by Mayor Sullivan, advocated for extreme caution and minimal publicity. If this turns out to be nothing more than a child's overactive imagination, we will have destroyed our tourism season and our town's reputation for absolutely nothing. Sullivan argued desperately. The opposing faction, which seemed to grow larger and more vocal by the minute, demanded immediate and decisive action. If there are people trapped down there suffering, every single minute we waste arguing could mean the difference between life and death, insisted Frank Carson, whose family had worked the mines for 4 generations and who had participated in numerous rescue operations during his younger years. Sheriff Chen watched this community division with growing concern. When his phone rang, he stepped outside to answer it, grateful for any excuse to escape the escalating confrontation. Dr. Foster saw his expression change dramatically from frustration to shock as he listened to the caller. He ended the conversation and strode quickly to her side. "Search team found an entrance," he said quietly, keeping his voice below the arguing crowd inside. "It's partially collapsed, but definitely passable, and there's clear evidence that someone small has been squeezing through recently." Marcus, Dr. Foster, confirmed with certainty. "There's more," Chen continued grimly. "We've been reviewing missing person reports from surrounding counties over the past year. 8 transient individuals have disappeared without any follow-up investigation. Nobody connected the dots because nobody looks very hard when homeless people vanish," she finished, her voice heavy with the weight of this societal truth. As they spoke, a commotion erupted from the edge of town. Deputy Tor's patrol car skidded to a halt in front of the town hall, emergency lights flashing urgently. He jumped out, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sheriff, we found the opening," he called breathlessly. "And sir, we can definitely hear voices coming from inside, human voices." The makeshift command center that sprang up in the parking lot of the abandoned lumber mill buzzed with intense activity as Sheriff Chen spread updated mining maps across the hood of his patrol vehicle. Powerful floodlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating the worried faces of search team leaders and concerned townspeople who had gathered behind hastily erected yellow police tape. "Here's what we know for certain," Chen announced, his finger tracing a path on the weathered paper. "The old ventilation shaft near Copper Creek has suffered a partial collapse, but there's still an opening large enough for someone Marcus's size to squeeze through. Deputy Tors has confirmed hearing multiple voices from inside, though we haven't been able to establish clear communication yet." Harold Thompson adjusted his thick glasses, squinting at the map with the expertise of someone who had spent decades navigating these underground passages. "That particular shaft connects directly to the northern tunnel system," he indicated with a trembling finger marked by decades of manual labor. "If there was a significant collapse in the main gallery, any survivors would most likely be trapped in one of these 3 side chambers." He circled the areas with a red marker, his movements careful and deliberate. These locations would offer the most structural stability and the best chance for natural airflow. Dr. Foster approached with Marcus walking beside her, the boy's small hand clutched tightly in hers. Despite everything he had endured, his face showed remarkable determination for someone so young. "He wants to help us understand the layout," she explained to the sheriff. "He knows the exact route he's been taking." Chen knelt to Marcus's eye level, speaking with the gentle authority that had made him effective with children throughout his career. "Son, I understand you've been bringing food and supplies to people down there. Can you show us on this map exactly where they are?" Marcus studied the paper with intense concentration, his young brow furrowed as he tried to match the complex lines and symbols with his memories of dark tunnels and frightening passages. After several long moments, he placed his finger decisively on a spot marked Storage Chamber B. "The singing room is right next to here," he said softly, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times. "They stay there because clean water drips from the ceiling in the back corner, and it's the warmest place." Chen exchanged meaningful glances with Harold. "That makes perfect sense," the old engineer confirmed with a nod. "That chamber would have natural water seepage from the limestone formations above. If people are trapped underground, access to fresh water would be absolutely critical for survival." As preparations continued with increasing urgency, Mayor Sullivan arrived in her official town car, the engine grinding to a halt on the gravel road. She surveyed the scene with obvious dismay. The growing crowd of concerned citizens, the news vans setting up sophisticated satellite equipment, the emergency vehicles painting the surrounding trees in flashes of red and blue light. "Dave," she hissed, pulling the sheriff aside with barely controlled panic in her voice. "This is exactly the scenario I was trying to prevent. We have journalists from Burlington, Boston, and even New York. This story is going national, and it's going to destroy us." Chen's weathered face hardened with resolve. "With all due respect, Madam Mayor, we may have 7 people fighting for their lives in those tunnels. Your concerns about the town's public image will have to take a backseat to human lives." "You don't understand the full implications," Sullivan insisted, lowering her voice further and glancing around nervously. "If those mines are reopened for a full investigation, there will be serious questions about why they weren't properly sealed in the first place. The town council of 1994, which included my father and several other prominent families still living here, officially certified that all entrances were permanently and safely closed. If that certification was inadequate or falsified, the liability issues could." Understanding dawned on Chen's face like a cold sunrise. "You're worried about lawsuits and financial liability. I'm worried about this town's very survival," Sullivan countered desperately. "One major lawsuit could bankrupt Millbrook completely. We barely have enough money in our reserves to keep the streetlights functioning through the winter months." Their heated conversation was interrupted by the dramatic arrival of a state police helicopter, its powerful rotors whipping the tree branches violently as it descended into the adjacent field. From the aircraft emerged Captain Sarah Hughes of the Vermont State Emergency Response Team, accompanied by 2 rescue specialists carrying cases of sophisticated equipment. "Sheriff Chen," Hughes called out, ducking under the spinning rotors and approaching with professional efficiency. "My team is completely at your disposal. I understand we have a complex underground rescue situation developing." As Chen brought Captain Hughes up to speed on every detail they had discovered, Dr. Foster sat with Marcus on the tailgate of a pickup truck, both wrapped in warm blankets against the deepening autumn cold. "Can you tell me exactly how you first found these people, Marcus?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone trained to work with traumatized children. The boy's eyes remained fixed on the dark opening of the ventilation shaft, now brilliantly illuminated by professional floodlights. as rescue workers carefully assessed its structural stability. Grandpa Thomas used to tell me amazing stories about the mines, he began, his voice small but growing steadier as he spoke. He showed me old photographs and maps, and he said there were secret passages that nobody remembered anymore, hidden ways that even the mine bosses didn't know about. Marcus pulled the blanket tighter around his thin shoulders. After Grandpa died, I wanted to find those places he told me about. It made me feel close to him again. And you found one of these secret ways. Marcus nodded earnestly. Behind the big oak tree that fell down in our backwoods during the ice storm 2 winters ago. When the roots came up, they made a hole that goes down deep into the earth. I was just exploring at first, trying to imagine what Grandpa's work was like. His voice dropped to a whisper. That's when I heard Jenny calling for help. She sounded so scared and weak. Rose Williams approached carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee from the volunteer refreshment station that had been hastily set up. She handed one to Dr. Foster and sat heavily beside her grandson, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. Marcus and his grandfather had an incredibly special bond, she explained quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Thomas died suddenly last spring from a massive heart attack. They were planning a camping trip to the old mining areas when it happened. Her voice broke slightly. I think Marcus has been looking for ways to feel connected to his grandfather's memory, to understand the world that Thomas loved so much. Meanwhile, rescue preparations intensified with military precision. Captain Hughes's team had deployed sensitive listening equipment, confirming movement and multiple faint voices approximately 200 feet into the tunnel system. A structural engineer carefully examined the shaft entrance, declaring it dangerously unstable, but potentially navigable with proper support equipment and extreme caution. We can't send a full rescue team through that opening, Hughes explained to Chen, pointing at the narrow gap partially blocked by fallen rocks and twisted metal. The structural integrity is too compromised. We're going to need a very small extraction team, and they'll have to place emergency supports as they advance. Deputy Torres stepped forward immediately. I'll go, Sheriff. I'm certified in confined space rescue from my time with the Burlington Fire Department. Chen nodded, impressed by the young deputy's courage, but concerned about the risks. But we need someone else with underground experience and rescue training. I can do it, came a quiet voice from behind them. Frank Carson, a third-generation miner and current maintenance supervisor at Millbrook Elementary School, stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. I worked with the mine rescue team for 18 years before the operations closed. My certification might be expired on paper, but the rocks don't care about bureaucratic paperwork. He offered a grim smile that spoke of years of dangerous underground work. As night fell completely over the forest, the rescue operation transformed the peaceful woodland into something resembling a sophisticated military encampment. Diesel generators hummed constantly, powering the intense flood lights that cast harsh shadows among the ancient trees. Medical personnel established a complete triage area in anticipation of injured survivors, while structural engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce the shaft entrance with steel supports and safety equipment. Dr. Foster found Sheriff Chen standing alone for a moment, staring at the frantic activity with a mixture of determination and something that looked surprisingly like deep fear. "You've been avoiding going near the entrance," she observed quietly, her trained eye recognizing classic avoidance behaviors. He didn't look at her when he responded. That obvious to a professional, huh? Only to someone who's specifically trained to notice these patterns, she assured him. "What's causing your reluctance?" Chen sighed deeply, the sound carrying years of buried pain. "My older brother died in the Westridge mine collapse of 1982. I was 17 years old. They never recovered his body from the debris." He rubbed absently at his chest, as if trying to ease an old ache. "I haven't been able to go underground since then. Can't even handle the basement in my own house without feeling like I'm suffocating." Before she could respond with appropriate therapeutic words, Rose Williams approached urgently, her face pale with panic. "Amanda, have you seen Marcus anywhere? I can't find him anywhere, and he was just here a few minutes ago." Alarm rippled through the assembled rescue team like an electric shock. Search teams that had been methodically preparing for the mine rescue operation suddenly turned their attention to the surrounding woods, calling Marcus's name with increasing desperation. Sheriff Chen organized an immediate grid search, his face masked with professional calm that did little to hide his growing terror. The boy had vanished without a trace. It was Deputy Torres who made the crucial discovery, his powerful flashlight beam catching a small footprint in the soft earth near the ventilation shaft entrance. "Sheriff," he called urgently, "I think he went back inside." The realization hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Marcus, believing he needed to fulfill his promise to those trapped underground, had slipped away during the commotion and entered the dangerous mine alone. The small opening they had been carefully reinforcing showed clear signs of recent disturbance. The 9-year-old boy had returned to the darkness, possibly trapping himself with the very people he had been trying to save. "We move immediately," Chen ordered, his personal fears buried beneath urgent necessity and protective instincts. "Prep team, you have 5 minutes to finish securing that entrance. Torres, Carson, you're with me. We're going down as soon as it's structurally safe enough." Captain Hughes stepped forward in protest. "Sheriff, with all due respect, you're not trained for this type of technical rescue operation. My specialized team can." "Your team won't fit through that narrow opening," Chen cut her off firmly. "And we don't have time to widen it safely without risking further collapse. That boy knows these tunnels, but he's heading into an extremely unstable section. I'm going after him, with or without official approval." As the final preparations were completed with desperate efficiency, Dr. Foster pulled Chen aside, her concern evident. "Dave, I know about your claustrophobia and the trauma surrounding your brother's death. Are you absolutely certain you can handle this?" His eyes met hers, fear and determination battling visibly in his expression. "No," he admitted with brutal honesty. "I'm absolutely terrified, but that boy needs someone he trusts, and apparently there are 7 other people down there who have been waiting far too long already for help to arrive." 25 minutes later, Sheriff Chen found himself doing the one thing he had sworn he would never do again. Squeezing his broad shoulders through a narrow mine entrance, while feeling the crushing weight of thousands of tons of earth pressing down from above. Torres went first, followed by Carson, with Chen bringing up the rear. Each man carried emergency supplies, sophisticated communication equipment, and the private weight of what they might find in the darkness below. The tunnel opened slightly, after the initial claustrophobic passage, allowing them to move in a crouch rather than crawling on their bellies. Their powerful headlamps cut bright yellow cones through the absolute darkness, occasionally reflecting off the rusted remains of old mining equipment or support beams that were slowly rotting with age and constant moisture. Marcus, Torres called, his voice echoing eerily down the seemingly endless passageway. "Marcus Williams, this is Deputy Torres." Chen fought to control his rapid breathing, focusing intensely on the immediate mission rather than the oppressive tonnage of earth above his head. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool subterranean air that felt damp and heavy in his lungs. "Keep moving forward," he muttered, as much to himself as to his companions, using the same words his brother had said during their last conversation. They followed Marcus's clearly visible footprints in the accumulated dust and debris, the tracks showing where the ground was dry enough to preserve them. The boy had moved with surprising confidence through the labyrinthine passageways, taking turns that weren't marked on any of their historical maps. "He really does know his way around down here," Carson remarked with genuine admiration, examining a junction where Marcus had unhesitatingly chosen the left passage. "Smart kid, probably been exploring these tunnels for months." After 30 minutes of careful progress through increasingly narrow passages, they reached a section where the ceiling had partially collapsed, creating a gap so tight they would have to squeeze through one at a time. As Chen prepared to follow his deputies through the constricted opening, the ancient wooden timber above them released an ominous groan that sent ice through his veins. He froze completely, childhood memories flooding back with terrifying clarity. His mother's inconsolable tears, the grim faces of the rescue team emerging empty-handed, the sound of earth shifting and settling in the darkness. Sheriff Torres called from the other side of the collapse, his voice muffled but concerned. "You okay back there?" Chen closed his eyes tightly, forcing down the rising panic that threatened to paralyze him completely. "Coming through," he managed to say, pushing himself into the suffocating space. Halfway through the narrow gap, a shower of loose dirt and small rocks rained down from above, triggering every primal fear buried in his psyche. For one terrible moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything except being buried alive in the darkness. Then faintly but clearly, he heard it. A child's voice calling from somewhere ahead, growing stronger and more urgent. Marcus was close, and he was calling for help. With renewed determination born of protective instincts stronger than fear, Chen forced himself through the remaining gap, emerging dusty and shaken, but intact on the other side. They found themselves in a larger chamber, their headlamp beams revealing the ghostly remains of old mining operations. A rusted cart sitting on twisted rails, abandoned pickaxes leaning against the walls, and the skeletal frame of what might once have been a supervisor's desk. And there, inscribed on the wall in faded white paint, were the words "Storage B." "This is it," Carson whispered, his voice filled with awe and apprehension. The cathedral chamber should be just through that tunnel entrance. As if confirming his words, they heard voices from that direction. Multiple adult voices mixed with the higher pitch of a child. Marcus had successfully reached the survivors, but now all of them were trapped together in the unstable underground maze. Back on the surface, tension mounted exponentially as the minutes ticked by with no communication from the rescue team. Radio signals couldn't penetrate the layers of rock and earth, leaving those above ground in agonizing silence and uncertainty. Rose Williams sat wrapped in heavy blankets beside Dr. Foster, her weathered face etched with the special agony of a guardian whose child is in mortal danger. "He's been through so much tragedy already," Rose whispered, her voice barely audible above the generator noise. "Losing his parents in that fire, then Thomas dying so suddenly last spring. Marcus and his grandfather were absolutely inseparable. When Thomas died, something fundamental in Marcus just seemed to withdraw from the world." She twisted her wedding ring nervously around her finger. "I should have recognized the warning signs, should have seen how much pain he was carrying alone." Dr. Foster took the older woman's trembling hand in both of hers. "Children process grief in completely individual ways, Rose. Marcus found a purpose in helping others who were suffering. That demonstrates extraordinary compassion and emotional strength, not weakness. But why wouldn't he tell me what he was doing? Why carry such a terrible burden all by himself?" Before Dr. Foster could formulate an appropriate response, sudden commotion erupted near the command post. Captain Hughes was receiving the first broken transmission from the underground rescue team. The static-filled message causing the assembled crowd to fall completely silent. "Found them," Tor's voice crackled through heavy interference. "7 survivors confirmed, just like the boy said. Need immediate medical evacuation. Repeat, need immediate medical evacuation." A spontaneous cheer went up from the townspeople, quickly hushed as they strained to hear additional details through the poor transmission quality. The fragmentary radio messages that followed painted a sobering picture of the conditions below ground. The survivors, all individuals reported missing from homeless shelters and social services in surrounding counties, had been trapped for nearly 4 months after a structural collapse blocked their only known exit route. They had survived on minimal groundwater seepage, and whatever meager food supplies Marcus had managed to bring them over the past 6 weeks. Their physical condition was deteriorating rapidly with each passing day. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the pine-covered hills, casting long shadows across the rescue site, the initial survivor emerged from the mine shaft. A woman appearing to be in her 40s, so emaciated that her bones seemed to push against her skin like tent poles stretched too tight. Medical personnel rushed forward immediately with a stretcher, oxygen equipment, and intravenous fluids, their movements precise and urgent. One by one, the remaining survivors followed, each in progressively worse condition than the last. Mayor Sullivan watched from a careful distance, her earlier political concerns momentarily forgotten as the human drama unfolded before her eyes. The story developing was no longer about municipal liability or tourism revenue. It had become a testament to survival against impossible odds and the extraordinary courage of a 9-year-old boy who had refused to let strangers perish in darkness and isolation. The cathedral chamber had earned its mystical name honestly. Sheriff Chen stood transfixed as his headlamp swept across the vast underground space, its beam insufficient to fully illuminate the enormous natural cavern. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like the pipes of some great stone organ, and in many places, the limestone walls sparkled with mineral deposits that caught and reflected their artificial light in thousands of tiny, brilliant stars. Under different circumstances, He might have found it breathtakingly beautiful, but beauty wasn't what commanded his attention in this moment. In the far corner of the cavern, 7 severely emaciated figures huddled together for warmth, their gaunt faces turning toward the light with expressions ranging from disbelief to desperate hope. And there, kneeling beside a particularly frail young woman, was Marcus Williams, their small savior, still wearing his muddy Superman pajamas. "Sheriff," the boy called out, his voice echoing dramatically in the vast space. "I told them you would come. I promised them help was coming." Chen crossed the chamber in long, urgent strides, Deputy Torres and Frank Carson close behind him. The smell hit him first: unwashed bodies, human waste, and the heavy, musty scent of prolonged underground confinement. The survivors watched their approach with the weary, cautious eyes of people who had learned through bitter experience to expect the worst from life. "My name is Sheriff David Chen," he announced, kneeling to their level with respectful dignity. "We're here to get all of you out safely." A woman with severely matted gray hair and hollow cheeks reached out with a trembling hand toward him, as if testing whether he was real or just another hallucination born of desperation and starvation. "We thought we were going to die down here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All of us except the boy. He never gave up hope. He kept telling us that help would come." Torres was already conducting rapid medical assessments, his emergency training taking over. 7 adults, all showing severe signs of malnutrition and dehydration, he reported into his radio, though the transmission was unlikely to reach the surface from this depth. "One appears critical, possibly septic." He indicated the young woman Marcus had been attending to, barely more than a teenager, with fever-bright eyes and an obviously infected wound on her leg that had clearly become dangerously septic. "That's Jenny," Marcus explained with the serious expression of someone far older than his years. "She got hurt when the ceiling rocks fell down. I've been bringing her medicine from Grandma Rose's bathroom cabinet, but it's not helping her get better." Frank Carson had begun systematically examining the chamber for structural stability, his experienced miner's eye noting several concerning cracks in the support beams overhead. "We need to move everyone quickly," he warned urgently. "This section isn't nearly as stable as I'd hoped. The vibrations from our movement could trigger another collapse." "How did you all end up trapped down here?" Chen asked, directing his question to a man who seemed slightly less debilitated than the others. "Name's Robert," the man replied, his voice raspy from disuse and dehydration. "Most of us were just looking for warm, dry shelter when the weather turned brutal last November. These old mines stay consistently warm, and they're completely out of the wind and rain." He coughed, a hollow sound that echoed eerily off the chamber walls. "We found this space and figured it was safe enough for the winter, better than freezing to death on the streets." He paused to catch his breath before continuing. "Then, about 4 months back, there was a small earthquake, not major, but enough to cause problems. The main tunnel collapsed behind us, completely blocking our way out." He held up hands that were raw with old blisters and cuts from desperate digging. "We tried to clear the passage ourselves, but without proper tools and equipment, it was absolutely hopeless." A woman with a face prematurely aged by years of hardship picked up the tragic story. "We had some emergency supplies that we'd gathered, and we rationed everything we could. The fresh water dripping from that corner kept us alive, but our food ran out completely about 6 weeks ago. Her eyes turned to Marcus with something approaching religious reverence. Then this little angel appeared out of nowhere, squeezing through a gap we couldn't fit through, bringing us bread, water, hope itself. Tors had completed his preliminary medical assessment and returned to Chen's side. "Sheriff, the boy says he's been accessing this area through a completely different entrance than the one we used. A much smaller opening that connects to a maintenance tunnel. It's how he's been getting in and out safely." Chen turned to Marcus with renewed respect. "Is this true, son? There's another way out of here." The boy nodded enthusiastically. "It's behind the big tree that fell over near our house. The roots made a deep hole when they came up, and if you crawl through it for a really long time, you eventually get to the bigger tunnels." His expression grew serious. "But it's really, really tight. I have to crawl on my belly like a snake for what feels like forever before it gets big enough to stand up." Carson shook his head grimly after hearing this detailed description. "Too small for any adult to navigate safely. We'll have to use our original entry point for the evacuation, which means carrying everyone through some extremely challenging terrain." The logistics were truly daunting. The 7 survivors were far too weak to make the difficult journey back through the narrow, partially collapsed tunnel without significant assistance. The most critical case, Jenny, would need to be transported on an improvised stretcher, which would barely fit through the tightest sections of their escape route. "Tors, try to radio the surface team," Chen ordered, then remembered the futility of radio transmission from this depth. "Actually, Carson, you head back immediately and relay our exact situation to Captain Hughes. Tors and I will start preparing these people for transport and give them some basic medical care." As Carson departed through the chamber's exit tunnel, Chen and Tors began organizing the evacuation with military efficiency. They distributed the emergency water and high-calorie nutrition bars they had brought in their packs, watching as the survivors ate and drank with the careful restraint of people who had learned the harsh mathematics of scarcity through bitter experience. Marcus remained close to Jenny, whose condition was visibly deteriorating with each passing hour. The young woman's breathing had become increasingly labored, her skin burning hot with fever, yet clammy to the touch. Dr. Foster had provided basic medical training to the rescue team before they descended, giving Chen enough knowledge to recognize the advancing signs of life-threatening sepsis. "She doesn't have much time left," the sheriff muttered quietly to Tors, keeping his voice low so the others wouldn't overhear and lose hope. "We need to evacuate her first, and we need to move immediately." They fashioned an emergency stretcher from rescue blankets and 2 relatively intact pieces of abandoned mining equipment. The wooden handles of pickaxes that had lain forgotten in the darkness for decades. Jenny moaned softly as they carefully transferred her onto this makeshift medical transport, her eyes flickering open for a brief moment. "You came back," she whispered weakly, her unfocused gaze finding Marcus. "You really brought help, just like you promised." The boy squeezed her hand gently, his young face showing remarkable composure. "I told you I would never give up. I keep my promises." Above ground, the first pale light of dawn illuminated a scene of controlled chaos and desperate preparation. Medical teams had established a complete field hospital with heated treatment tents, equipped for immediate care of the expected conditions. Severe malnutrition dangerous dehydration, infected wounds, and prolonged exposure to harsh underground conditions. Multiple ambulances stood ready to transport the most critical cases to Burlington General Hospital, their engines running constantly to keep the passenger compartments warm in the crisp autumn morning air. Frank Carson emerged from the mine entrance like a ghost, completely covered in dirt and sweating heavily despite the cold temperature. Captain Hughes rushed to meet him, notebook ready to record every crucial detail. 7 survivors confirmed, Carson reported between desperate gulps of water from a bottle someone thrust into his hands. All adults, all in extremely rough condition. One critical case, young female with obvious infected wound, probable advanced sepsis. Sheriffs starting the evacuation immediately, bringing the critical case out first. The news rippled through the assembled crowd like electricity. Rose Williams pressed both hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. "And Marcus?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling with emotion. Carson offered a tired but genuine smile. "The kid's a genuine hero, ma'am. He's been keeping those people alive for weeks with nothing but determination and courage. Sheriff says he's completely unharmed, not even a scratch on him." Dr. Foster approached with her medical kit, professional concern evident in her expression. "What about the psychological state of everyone involved? The survivors and Marcus?" "The adults are about what you'd expect from people in their situation," Carson replied thoughtfully. "Shocked, disoriented, but rational and coherent. As for Marcus, he's acting like he's been running complex rescue operations his entire life. Cool as a cucumber, completely focused on helping others." Inside the mine, the evacuation had begun in earnest with careful precision. Sheriff Chen and Deputy Torres maneuvered Jenny's improvised stretcher through the cathedral's narrow exit tunnel, with Marcus leading the way through passages he knew better than anyone. The remaining survivors followed in a struggling line, each person paired with a member of the state rescue team, who had made their way underground after Carson's urgent report reached the surface. The journey was agonizingly slow and treacherous. Every few yards, they had to stop and completely reconfigure the stretcher to navigate around obstacles or squeeze through particularly narrow passages. Jenny had fallen unconscious during transport, which made the physical logistics easier, but dramatically heightened the medical urgency. Her breathing had become increasingly shallow and irregular, like a clock counting down toward an inevitable and tragic conclusion. They reached the most challenging section of their escape route. The partial collapse that had given Chen such difficulty during their inward journey. Torres went through the gap first, then helped guide the stretcher from the far side while Chen supported it from behind, both men working with desperate efficiency. As they carefully eased Jenny through the tight constriction, a deep, ominous groan emanated from the timber, supports directly above them. The sound of old wood finally reaching its breaking point under enormous pressure. "Move now," Chen ordered urgently, recognizing the unmistakable sound of structural failure. He gave the stretcher a final, powerful push through the gap, then prepared to follow immediately. But it was too late. With a crack like a gunshot echoing through the tunnel, the main support beam split completely in half. Rocks, earth, and debris showered down with tremendous force, filling the passage in mere seconds. Cooper and Jenny were safely through to the other side, but Chen found himself thrown backward by the impact, momentarily stunned, but otherwise uninjured. When the choking dust finally cleared enough to see, he faced a solid wall of debris where the passage had been just moments before. Sheriff Tor's muffled voice came through the collapsed section, panic evident even through the barrier of rock and earth. "Sheriff, can you hear me?" "I'm okay," Chen called back, coughing as he inhaled the dust-filled air. "Get Jenny to safety immediately. That's the absolute priority. Send a specialized team back for us once she's receiving proper medical care." "Us?" Tor's questioned through the debris wall, confusion evident in his voice. Chen turned around to discover he wasn't alone in this predicament. Marcus stood behind him, his young eyes wide, but remarkably calm considering their dire circumstances. Two of the adult survivors had also been caught on the wrong side of the collapse. Robert and the gray-haired woman who had first reached out to touch the sheriff when they arrived. "Yes, 4 of us total," Chen confirmed, his heart sinking as he realized the boy was now trapped underground with them. "Marcus is here too. Tell his grandmother he's safe, and we're actively looking for an alternative way out." The gray-haired woman, who had introduced herself as Margaret, touched Chen's arm with urgent intensity. "The boy's secret tunnel," she said breathlessly. "The way he's been coming and going all these weeks. It might be our only option now that this passage is completely blocked." Marcus nodded vigorously, his determination evident. "I can show you the way, Sheriff Chen. It's back through the cathedral chamber and then down a different tunnel that most people don't know about." Chen hesitated, every instinct screaming against going deeper into the unstable mind system rather than toward the surface and safety. Yet their options were severely limited. Digging through the fresh collapse would require heavy equipment and could take many hours they simply didn't have, particularly given the questionable stability of the surrounding rock structure. "Lead the way, son," he decided, pushing aside his mounting claustrophobia and fear. "But everyone stays close together. No one gets separated." Marcus accepted this responsibility with the seriousness of someone much older, moving with confident purpose through the dark passages. Robert supported Margaret, who was visibly weakening now that the initial adrenaline surge was fading. Chen brought up the rear, fighting desperately against the sensation that the tunnel walls were slowly closing in with each step they took deeper into the earth. Above ground, the arrival of the first survivor triggered an explosion of coordinated activity. Jenny was rushed immediately to the waiting helicopter for emergency transport to Burlington General Hospital. Her condition critical but temporarily stabilized by the medical team's rapid intervention. The remaining survivors emerged one by one, each receiving immediate assessment and treatment before being transferred to waiting ambulances. Deputy Torres was the last to exit the mine, his face grave with concern as he reported the tunnel collapse to Captain Hughes and the assembled medical team. "The sheriff is trapped on the other side with the boy and 2 adult survivors," he explained, accepting a thermal blanket from a concerned paramedic. "He says they're going to attempt reaching the surface through an alternate route that Marcus knows about." Rose Williams swayed dangerously on her feet, requiring Dr. Foster's quick intervention to steady her. "James," the psychologist addressed Torres directly, "what are their realistic chances of success?" The deputy hesitated, clearly struggling to balance honesty with hope. If anyone can find a way out of that underground maze, it's Sheriff Chen and that remarkable boy. Marcus knows those tunnels better than anyone alive. Mayor Sullivan, who had been listening from nearby, stepped forward with an announcement that surprised everyone who had witnessed her earlier reluctance and political maneuvering. "I'm authorizing unlimited emergency resources," she declared firmly. "Whatever equipment, personnel, or expertise they need to rescue those people, make it happen immediately. Cost is no object." In the operations tent, mining engineers gathered around historical maps, trying to identify where Marcus's secret entrance might connect to the known tunnel systems. Harold Thompson traced possible routes with trembling fingers marked by decades of underground work. If the boy's been entering near his grandmother's property, he must be using one of the unofficial air shafts that run along this particular ridge, he theorized, his voice carrying the authority of experience. These weren't included on the official mining company maps because they were dug by the workers themselves to improve ventilation in the deeper sections without management approval. Meanwhile, far beneath the earth, Sheriff Chen followed Marcus through increasingly narrow passages that seemed to grow more constricted with each turn. His headlamp battery was beginning to weaken noticeably, the yellow beam dimming to a sickly orange glow that made their situation feel even more desperate. Robert continued supporting Margaret, whose strength was failing rapidly with each difficult step. The thin mountain air grew progressively thinner as they moved farther from the cathedral's natural ventilation system. "How much farther do we have to go?" Chen asked, unable to completely hide the growing tension in his voice, as they crawled through a particularly tight section that required them to remove their equipment packs and push them ahead. "Almost to the really hard part," Marcus replied matter-of-factly, which was decidedly not the reassurance the sheriff had hoped to hear. "After this section, there's what I call the belly crawl, and then we can actually see real daylight." The belly crawl proved to be aptly named. A horizontal shaft barely 18 inches high that required them to wriggle forward on their stomachs like snakes through a drainage pipe. For Marcus, it was merely uncomfortable and claustrophobic. For the three adults, it represented a grueling test of physical endurance, mental determination, and sheer willpower. Chen went first after Marcus, forcing his broad shoulders through the constricted space while fighting waves of panic that threatened to overwhelm his rational mind. Every primitive instinct screamed at him to retreat, to find space and air and light. Only the knowledge that 3 lives depended entirely on his courage kept him moving forward, inch by agonizing inch through the suffocating darkness. "I can see it," Marcus called excitedly from ahead, his young voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I can see the light." And indeed, a faint grayish illumination now became visible ahead of them. Natural daylight filtering down through what appeared to be a complex tangle of tree roots and disturbed earth. The promise of open sky and fresh air gave them renewed determination to push through the final, most difficult section of their underground ordeal. One by one, they emerged into the crisp autumn morning like underground creatures seeing sunlight for the first time. First Marcus, then Sheriff Chen, followed by Robert supporting the nearly unconscious Margaret. They found themselves in a small forest clearing, where a massive oak tree had toppled during a severe ice storm years earlier. Its upturned root system creating the exact opening through which they had escaped. Chen immediately activated his emergency radio, now free of the earth and rock that had blocked all communication. "This is Sheriff Chen," he reported, his voice hoarse with dust and overwhelming emotion. "We're out safely. All 4 of us have reached the surface. Send immediate medical assistance to the Williams property, north edge of the woods near the old oak tree." As Margaret was gently lowered to the soft forest floor, and Robert collapsed beside her in complete exhaustion, Chen turned to find Marcus standing quietly nearby, watching him with those solemn, intelligent eyes that had witnessed far too much tragedy for someone so young. "You did it, son," the sheriff said, placing a grateful hand on the boy's shoulder. "You saved them. You saved all of them, including me." Marcus's serious expression finally broke into the unreserved, brilliant smile of a child who had accomplished something truly remarkable. "We did it together," he corrected with characteristic generosity, throwing his arms around Chen's waist in a spontaneous hug that nearly overwhelmed the man's carefully maintained professional composure. Above them, the distinctive rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of medical evacuation teams. Help had finally come to those who had waited so long in darkness. They had survived their underground ordeal, and the cathedral chamber had yielded its last secrets. Its forgotten congregation was finally returning to the world of light and hope. The steady electronic beeping of hospital monitors provided a rhythmic soundtrack to the hushed conversations throughout Burlington General Hospital's intensive care unit. 5 days had passed since the dramatic rescue operation, and the survivors were distributed across various floors and apartments according to their individual medical conditions and treatment needs. 6 of the rescued individuals were stable and responding well to comprehensive treatment for severe malnutrition, dangerous dehydration, and prolonged exposure to harsh underground conditions. The 7th survivor, Jenny Morrison, continued fighting for her life in ICU room 12, where advanced sepsis had ravaged her young body's systems despite the most aggressive medical intervention available. Sheriff Chen stood in the hospital corridor, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared through the reinforced glass at the unconscious young woman. At only 22 years old, Jenny should have had her entire life stretching ahead of her, filled with possibilities and dreams. Instead, she looked ancient and fragile in her hospital bed, connected to an array of tubes and wires that monitored every failing system in her body. Sheriff Dr. Emma Winters, the ICU specialist overseeing Jenny's care, approached with a tablet computer and the grave expression that Chen had learned to dread. "Do you have a moment to discuss her condition?" Chen nodded heavily, following her to a small, private consultation room nearby. The doctor's facial expression told him everything he needed to know before she spoke a single word. "We're losing her," Dr. Winters said with professional directness, setting her tablet down on the small table between them. The infection had spread too extensively throughout her system before we could begin effective treatment. Multiple organ systems are failing simultaneously. At this point, we're essentially buying time rather than providing curative care. The sheriff removed his hat, running a weary hand through his graying hair. "What about her family? Has anyone been located?" "That's actually part of why I wanted to speak with you personally," Dr. Winters said, opening a thin folder on her desk. We've been trying to locate next of kin since she was admitted, but according to her extremely limited records, her mother died 3 years ago from a drug overdose. Her father's whereabouts are completely unknown. She aged out of the foster care system when she turned 18 last year. She closed the folder with a gesture of finality. She has absolutely no one in the world. She has us, came a quiet but determined voice from the doorway. Dr. Foster stood there with Marcus Williams at her side, the boy's eyes fixed intently on the folder containing Jenny's sparse life history. She told me about her mother, Marcus said softly, his voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. Down in the dark tunnels when she got really scared and sad. She said her mom used to sing her a special song about butterflies dancing in a garden when she was little and couldn't sleep. Dr. Winters glanced at her colleague questioningly, unsure about the appropriateness of a child being involved in such a serious medical discussion. Dr. Foster nodded reassuringly. Marcus has been thoroughly evaluated by our best child psychologists. He's processing everything remarkably well, and he specifically requested to visit all the survivors. He feels a deep personal responsibility for their well-being. Jenny saved Margaret's life, Marcus continued with earnest conviction. When the ceiling rocks started falling down, she pushed Margaret out of the way. That's exactly how her leg got hurt so badly. The boy's chin trembled slightly with emotion. She's a real hero too, just like everyone keeps saying I am. Sheriff Chen knelt to Marcus's eye level, his weathered face showing deep respect. You're absolutely right, son, and we'll make sure everyone knows about her courage and sacrifice. Outside Burlington General Hospital, media trucks continued to line the street in impressive formation. The rescue operation had captured national attention, evolving hourly as new details emerged. The narrative had grown from the initial dramatic discovery of a traumatized child on a deserted highway to the revelation of 7 people trapped underground, followed by the heroic rescue effort and the incredible story of a 9-year-old boy who had secretly sustained strangers for weeks with nothing but determination and compassion. Cable news channels had dispatched their most empathetic reporters to cover the human interest angle. Morning television shows clamored for exclusive interviews with the key figures. Social media platforms erupted with hashtags like Millbrook Hero and Thayer Still Here, transforming a local tragedy into a national conversation about social responsibility and community values. Mayor Sullivan, who had initially been primarily concerned about negative publicity and its impact on tourism revenue, had pivoted masterfully to embrace the story's inspirational elements. She now stood before the hospital's main entrance, delivering her 4th press conference of the day for an audience of journalists from across New England. The extraordinary courage demonstrated by young Marcus Williams exemplifies the very best values of our close-knit community. She intoned gravely for the cameras, her politician's instincts fully engaged. Millbrook has always been a town where neighbors look out for neighbors, where we take care of those who need our help the most. The bitter irony wasn't lost on those who understood the complete truth, that the survivors had been effectively invisible to the broader community before their underground ordeal. These were people who had slipped through society's safety net, seeking basic shelter in abandoned mines, because they had literally nowhere else to turn for protection from the harsh Vermont winter. Now they were celebrities of sorts, their harrowing survival story commodified for public consumption and feel-good news segments. In her hospital room on the third floor, Margaret Holloway watched the media coverage with a complex mixture of amusement and profound discomfort. After 68 years of being largely ignored by mainstream society, the sudden intense attention felt surreal and somewhat overwhelming. "They're calling us the Cathedral 7 now," she remarked to Rose Williams, who had taken to visiting the hospital daily like a devoted family member. As if we're some kind of tourist attraction or inspirational exhibit. Rose adjusted the fresh autumn flowers she had brought, choosing cheerful chrysanthemums in vibrant orange and gold colors. The media always needs its convenient labels and catchy phrases, I suppose. "How are you feeling today, dear?" Margaret gestured weakly toward the IV drip, slowly delivering essential nutrients and medications into her system. "Stronger with every bag of this miraculous fluid. Dr. Patterson says I should be able to leave the hospital in a couple more days." Her expression grew uncertain and vulnerable, "though I'm honestly not entirely sure where I'll go from here." Rose hesitated for only a brief moment before responding. "I have a perfectly good spare bedroom that hasn't been used since my daughter moved to California. It's nothing fancy or luxurious, but it's warm, quiet, and peaceful. You'd be more than welcome to stay there while you get back on your feet and figure out your next steps." Tears welled up in Margaret's faded blue eyes, threatening to overflow. "Why would you do something so generous for me? You don't even really know who I am." "I know that you survived 4 months in absolute darkness and impossible conditions," Rose replied with simple, direct honesty. "And I know that my grandson risked everything he had to help you and the others. That tells me you're definitely worth knowing and caring about." Down the hospital corridor, Deputy Torres sat beside Robert Wilson's bed with his notebook open, conducting follow-up interviews for the ongoing investigation. The inquiry into how the survivors had become trapped had taken several unexpected and disturbing turns when Robert revealed that the initial tunnel collapse hadn't been entirely natural or accidental. "We had been using the cathedral chamber as our winter shelter for about 3 weeks when we started noticing construction workers with heavy equipment near the main mine entrance," Robert explained, his voice much stronger now after days of proper nutrition and medical care. "They were sealing up the opening more thoroughly than it had been before, using concrete and steel reinforcement beams. We tried calling out to them, tried to get their attention," he continued, his face darkening with the memory. "But either they genuinely couldn't hear us through all the rock and machinery noise, or he left the troubling implication hanging in the air. Or they deliberately ignored you," Torres finished grimly, his pen pausing mid-sentence. "Can you describe these workers in detail? Any vehicles, company logos, anything that might help us identify them?" "There was definitely a company logo on their hard hats," Robert said, concentrating hard on the memory. "Some kind of bird, maybe a hawk or falcon, and the name North Point underneath it." Tor's pen stopped moving entirely. "North Point Development Group," Robert nodded with certainty. "That sounds exactly right." The deputy's jaw tightened noticeably. Mayor Sullivan's brother-in-law served as CEO of North Point Development Group, the same company behind the controversial luxury vacation home development planned for the ridge directly above the old mining areas. The same development that Sullivan had been aggressively promoting as Millbrook's economic salvation and path to prosperity. In the ICU, Jenny Morrison's condition continued its relentless deterioration. By early evening, her blood pressure had dropped to critically dangerous levels, despite maximum medication support and round-the-clock monitoring. The medical team had exhausted every available treatment option, but the combination of infection, starvation, and prolonged trauma had simply taken too great a toll on her young body's ability to fight and recover. Dr. Foster found Marcus sitting quietly in the ICU waiting room, his legs dangling from a chair designed for adults, clutching a small paper bag in his hands. "What do you have there, Marcus?" she asked gently, settling into the chair beside him. The boy opened the bag carefully to reveal a delicate, handmade butterfly crafted from colored tissue paper and twisted pipe cleaners, its wings painted in brilliant yellows and oranges. "It's for Jenny," he explained with touching solemnity. "Because of the butterfly song her mom used to sing to her when she was scared." Dr. Foster felt her heart breaking at this simple gesture of compassion. "Marcus, there's something very important we need to talk about. Jenny is extremely sick, much sicker than the doctors can fix." "I know," the boy said with startling directness. "She's going to die soon, isn't she?" The frank honesty of children never ceased to amaze her, even after years of professional experience. "The doctors are doing absolutely everything they possibly can, but yes, they think she might die very soon." Marcus considered this information with the gravity of someone far older than his 9 years. "Can I see her one more time before that happens? I want to say goodbye properly." After consultation with Dr. Winters and careful consideration of all the factors involved, permission was granted. Sheriff Chen accompanied them to Jenny's room, watching through the glass observation window as Marcus approached the bed with solemn, respectful purpose. The boy gently placed the paper butterfly on the pillow beside Jenny's head, then leaned close to whisper something in her ear that no one else could hear. Whatever words were shared in that sacred moment belonged only to the giver and receiver, even when one might be beyond the ability to respond. That night, as a crisp autumn moon rose over the mountains surrounding Millbrook, Jenny Morrison slipped peacefully away from the world. The paper butterfly remained on her pillow, a symbol of hope and transformation that had come too late to save her life, but had provided comfort in her final hours. She was 22 years old, with so many dreams left unfulfilled. The news of Jenny's death hit the rescue team and the entire community like a physical blow. For Sheriff Chen, who had pulled the young woman from darkness only to lose her to its lingering effects, the loss felt deeply personal and painful. He sat alone in his office well past midnight, a glass of bourbon untouched on his desk, staring at the mining maps that still covered every available surface. His phone's sudden ringing startled him from his dark reverie. Deputy Tor's voice came through the line, tense with controlled anger and determination. "Sheriff, you need to see what I've discovered. I've been going through all the building permits and safety documentation for the North Point development project. They were legally required to conduct a complete safety survey of the entire mine system before beginning any construction work, and they filed official paperwork claiming this comprehensive survey had been completed." Torres paused for effect before delivering the devastating conclusion. "But I've found concrete evidence that the survey was completely falsified. They knew those mines weren't properly sealed. They knew there could be accessible openings and potential safety hazards. They just decided it was cheaper and more convenient to pour some concrete over the obvious entrances and call the job finished. Chen's grief crystallized into something harder and more focused, righteous anger. You're telling me they endangered those people's lives deliberately. I'm saying they cut corners to save money and time. And Jenny Morrison died because of their criminal negligence. Torres replied with conviction. In her modest home on Oak Street, Rose Williams sat on the edge of Marcus's bed, watching her grandson sleep peacefully for the first time in many months. The terrible secret responsibility he had carried alone for so long had finally been lifted from his young shoulders, allowing him to rest without the weight of others' survival pressing down on his conscience. She gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, marveling at the quiet strength and moral courage housed in such a small frame. The phone call from the hospital had come 2 hours earlier, and Rose had wept for the young woman she had never met in person, but whose courage had helped save Margaret's life, whose suffering had ended far too soon. She had debated whether to wake Marcus with the tragic news, ultimately deciding that morning would bring its own sorrows soon enough. For now, let him sleep peacefully. Let him simply be a child, unburdened by adult tragedies and the harsh realities of a world that, too, often failed its most vulnerable members. Outside her window, the autumn wind picked up strength, rustling through the trees that were beginning to surrender their leaves to the season's inevitable progression. Change was coming to Millbrook in ways no one could have anticipated when Marcus Williams first appeared on Route 17 just days ago. Some changes, Rose reflected sadly, exacted a terrible price that seemed almost too heavy to bear. The Millbrook Community Center had never hosted such a large gathering in its entire history. Every folding chair was occupied, with people standing 4 deep along all the walls. The crowd spilled out into the parking lot, where hastily installed speakers allowed those outside to hear the proceedings that would determine their town's future. 2 weeks after the rescue operation, the community had gathered to confront the truth about what had happened and to demand accountability from those responsible. Sheriff Chen stood at the podium, his usually pristine uniform showing signs of a man who had barely slept since Jenny Morrison's death. The investigation had consumed every waking moment, each new discovery fueling a determination for justice that burned brighter than his exhaustion. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. "I know there have been countless rumors circulating about what really happened in the Jefferson mine. Tonight, I want to present the complete truth based on our thorough investigation." A profound hush fell over the assembly as Chen unfolded an official document with deliberate ceremony. Last December, 8 individuals seeking basic shelter from the brutal winter, whether found their way into the old mine system through entrances that should have been permanently and safely sealed decades ago. He began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. In February, a secondary structural collapse trapped them in the section we now know as the Cathedral Chamber. He paused, allowing the timeline to register with his audience before continuing. For 4 months, they survived on minimal groundwater and whatever meager supplies they could gather. Then, 9-year-old Marcus Williams discovered them during his explorations of the areas his grandfather had shown him. For the next 7 weeks, Marcus secretly brought them food, water, and hope, keeping them alive until he could find a way to bring help. Chen gestured to Deputy Torres, who activated a projector system borrowed from the high school. On the large screen appeared construction permits, safety certifications, and official documentation. What we discovered during our investigation is deeply disturbing. Chen continued, his voice growing harder with each word. North Point Development Group was legally required by state law to conduct a comprehensive safety survey of the entire mine system before beginning construction on their luxury housing project. They filed official paperwork claiming this survey had been completed and all safety protocols had been followed. The next slide showed dated photographs of construction workers pouring concrete into mine entrances, their company logos clearly visible on their hard hats and equipment. We now have irrefutable evidence that this safety survey was completely falsified, Chen announced, his words causing a ripple of shocked murmurs throughout the assembly. North Point deliberately cut corners, hastily sealing only the most obvious entrances without properly documenting or inspecting the extensive tunnel network beneath our community. He clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of events. When their workers sealed the main entrance in January, they unknowingly trapped 8 human beings inside, condemning them to months of suffering in darkness and near-starvation conditions. All eyes in the room turned toward Mayor Sullivan, seated prominently in the front row, her face pale as paper. Her family connection to North Point through her brother-in-law was common knowledge throughout the small community. Furthermore, Chen continued relentlessly, we have documented evidence that multiple reports of strange sounds and voices from the mine areas were filed with the town council over the past year. These reports were never investigated, never followed up on, and never brought to the attention of emergency services. The implications hung heavy in the air as townspeople began to grasp the full scope of the negligence involved. One young woman lost her life because of this criminal negligence, Chen said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. Jenny Morrison died 6 days ago from complications related to injuries and infections sustained during her months trapped underground. She was 22 years old, with her entire life ahead of her. He stepped back from the podium, visibly collecting himself before delivering the final, devastating blow. The district attorney's office has opened a comprehensive criminal investigation into North Point Development Group for charges including negligent homicide, falsification of safety records, and corporate malfeasance. Mayor Sullivan has been asked to take immediate administrative leave, pending a thorough investigation into her knowledge of these activities and any potential conflicts of interest. The community center erupted in shouting, angry questions, and demands for immediate action. Through the chaos, Dr. Foster watched Sheriff Chen maintain his professional composure, answering what questions he could while promising complete transparency throughout the legal proceedings. She noticed how he deliberately redirected questions about Marcus, continuing to shield the boy from becoming an even greater object of public fascination and media attention. From her seat in the back of the packed room, Margaret Holloway observed the proceedings with a mixture of profound sadness and bitter vindication. Beside her sat Robert Wilson, and the other 4 survivors, now known collectively as the Cathedral 6, following Jenny's tragic death. The media had transformed their ordeal into a national conversation about homelessness, about society's forgotten members, and about the systems that routinely failed the most vulnerable people. Rose Williams kept a protective arm around Marcus throughout the emotionally charged meeting. The boy seemed smaller somehow, more withdrawn since Jenny's death, in a way that deeply concerned both his grandmother and Dr. Foster. He had barely spoken in the past week, answering questions with simple nods or single-word responses. The psychological impact of everything he had experienced, from his solitary rescue missions to the ultimate loss of someone he had tried desperately to save, was only beginning to manifest in concerning ways. After the formal presentation concluded, the meeting devolved into heated discussions and arguments throughout the community center. Small groups formed and dissolved as neighbors debated with neighbors about responsibility, accountability, and what steps should be taken next. Dr. Foster made her way to where Rose and Marcus sat quietly, both appearing overwhelmed by the intensity of emotions surrounding them. "How is he doing?" she asked quietly, studying Marcus with professional concern. Rose shook her head with worry. "Barely sleeping at all. When he does manage to fall asleep, he has terrible nightmares about being trapped underground, about not being able to help someone who needs him. That's completely normal and expected after traumatic experiences like this," Foster assured her, though her own concern was evident. "Marcus, would you like to step outside for some fresh air? It's gotten pretty crowded and loud in here." The boy nodded silently, following her outside without protest. They found a quiet spot on a wooden bench beneath an old maple tree, its leaves transformed into brilliant shades of crimson and gold by the approaching autumn season. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars emerge in the deepening twilight sky above the surrounding mountains. "I keep thinking about Jenny all the time," Marcus finally said, his voice small but steady. "She told me about all the places she wanted to visit someday when she got out of there. The ocean, the Grand Canyon, New York City, Disney World." He pulled his jacket tighter around his thin shoulders. Now she'll never get to see any of those wonderful places. Dr. Foster chose her words carefully, drawing on years of experience helping children process grief and trauma. "That is very sad, and it's completely okay and healthy to feel that sadness deeply. But Marcus, you gave Jenny something incredibly precious during her last months of life. Do you know what that was?" Marcus shook his head, his young face serious and attentive. "Hope," Foster continued gently. "And she didn't die alone in the darkness, forgotten by the world. Because of your courage and determination, she got to feel sunlight on her face again. She got to know that people cared about what happened to her, that her life had value and meaning." Marcus considered this perspective with the thoughtful gravity that had become characteristic of him since the rescue. "I wanted to save everyone. I really wanted to bring them all home safely. I know you did, and what you accomplished was absolutely remarkable, Marcus. You saved 6 human lives, 6 people who would have died without your help and courage. That's something most adults never get the chance to do in their entire lifetime." Inside the community center, the town meeting had fractured into multiple confrontations and heated debates. The loudest argument centered around Mayor Sullivan. who found herself surrounded by increasingly angry residents, demanding to know exactly how much she had known about North Point's corner-cutting practices. "My brother-in-law runs the company." "Yes," Sullivan admitted, perspiration beading on her forehead, despite the cool evening air flowing through the open windows. "But I had absolutely no knowledge of falsified safety records or deliberate negligence." "Really, none at all?" accused Frank Carson, the former miner who had assisted in the rescue operation. "You pushed that development project through the approval process faster than anything this town has ever seen. You overrode environmental concerns, historical preservation objections, and safety questions from multiple community members. I was trying to save this town from complete economic collapse," Sullivan shot back desperately. "Do you have any idea how close Millbrook is to total bankruptcy? The development project meant jobs, tax revenue, and a sustainable future for our community." Sheriff Chen stepped between the confronting parties, sensing the situation teetering toward physical altercation. "That's enough for tonight. The criminal investigation will determine who knew what and when. This kind of argument isn't helping anyone, especially not the survivors who are still recovering." As the crowd reluctantly began to disperse, Deputy Torres approached with a middle-aged woman in a professional business suit. "Sheriff, this is Rebecca Lawson from the governor's office." Torres introduced them. "She'd like to speak with you privately about some broader implications of this situation." Ms. Lawson extended her hand with bureaucratic efficiency. "Sheriff Chen, I've been following your handling of this crisis very closely. The governor is extremely concerned about the broader implications of what's been uncovered here." "What kind of broader implications?" Chen asked cautiously. "There are literally hundreds of abandoned mines scattered across Vermont, Sheriff. Most of them were supposedly sealed decades ago. Many with the same questionable paperwork and oversight we're seeing with the North Point situation." She handed him her official business card. "The governor wants to establish a comprehensive statewide task force to address this issue systematically, and he would like you to serve as the co-chair." Chen blinked in surprise at the unexpected offer. "Ms. Lawson, I appreciate the governor's confidence, but my immediate priority right now is ensuring justice for Jenny Morrison and making sure the other survivors receive all the support and care they need." "Of course, and that's exactly why you're the right person for this position," Lawson replied smoothly. "But consider this carefully. How many other Cathedral Sixes might be out there right now? How many other Jenny Morrisons are we failing to protect because we don't know about these hidden dangers?" She handed him a thick folder containing preliminary research. "Think about it seriously. The governor will call you tomorrow morning to discuss the details." Outside, Dr. Foster continued her gentle conversation with Marcus, while Rose sat nearby, listening with the protective attention of a devoted guardian. "You know, when I was about your age, something happened that taught me I couldn't save everyone from pain and suffering," Foster shared, her voice carrying the wisdom of hard-earned experience. "My best friend got very sick with leukemia. Despite everyone trying their absolute best to help her, including the most skilled doctors and the most advanced treatments available, she died." Marcus looked up with interest, his attention focused for the first time in days. "What did you do after that happened?" he asked quietly. "I decided I wanted to understand why people hurt inside, not just their bodies but their minds and hearts too." That's why I became a psychologist and came back to Millbrook to help people." She smiled softly at the memory. Sometimes we can't save everyone we want to save, but that doesn't mean we should ever stop trying to help in whatever ways we can. The boy considered this wisdom, absently tracing patterns on the wooden bench with his finger. "Grandpa Thomas used to tell me stories about the mines, about how dangerous they were underground, but also about how the miners always looked out for each other, no matter what. Your grandfather sounds like he was a very wise man." "He was the smartest person I ever knew," Marcus replied, his voice catching slightly with emotion. "I miss him so much it makes my chest hurt sometimes. After he died, exploring the places he told me about made me feel close to him again. That's how I found them down there." His voice grew stronger. "I was looking for Grandpa's memory, but I found people who needed help instead." This simple revelation illuminated everything with sudden clarity. The boy's solitary expeditions underground had been a form of grief processing, a way to maintain connection with his beloved grandfather. Finding people in desperate need had given that grief a purpose, channeling his pain into life-saving action. Before Dr. Foster could respond with appropriate therapeutic guidance, Rose approached with obvious concern etched on her weathered features. "Sarah, there's a situation developing inside that you might want to help with. Margaret's having some kind of severe anxiety attack. The noise, the confrontations, all the chaos seems to have triggered something really serious." They hurried back into the community center to find Margaret Holloway hyperventilating in a corner, her breathing rapid and shallow. The other survivors had gathered protectively around her, but she was clearly in the grip of a full-scale panic attack. The crowd, the shouting arguments, the intense confrontations had triggered powerful memories. Perhaps flashbacks to the moment of the original collapse, perhaps simply the overwhelming stimulus after months of darkness and enforced silence. Dr. Foster knelt beside Margaret, speaking in low, calming tones while demonstrating controlled breathing techniques. Gradually, over the course of several tense minutes, Margaret's panic began to subside, her breathing returning to a more normal rhythm. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered, embarrassed by the attention her episode had drawn. "Everything just crashed down on me at once. What happened to us? What happened to poor Jenny? All these angry people shouting." "No apologies necessary," Foster assured her gently. "What you're experiencing is completely normal after severe trauma. Your nervous system is still recovering from months of extreme stress." To everyone's surprise, Marcus slipped through the circle of concerned adults and took Margaret's trembling hand in both of his small ones. "When I got really scared down in the dark tunnels," he said quietly, "I would close my eyes and think about sitting in Grandma Rose's garden in the sunshine, watching the butterflies land on the flowers." He looked directly into Margaret's eyes with remarkable composure. "You can come see our garden tomorrow if you want. The late roses are still blooming, and the butterflies still come every day." Margaret's face transformed completely, tears of gratitude replacing the tears of panic. "I would like that very much, Marcus. Thank you for the invitation." As the emotionally charged meeting finally began to disperse, townspeople lingered in small groups under the streetlights, their conversations continuing in more subdued tones. The full truth of what had happened in Millbrook was finally emerging, and it wasn't just about people trapped underground or corporate negligence. It was fundamentally about invisibility, about how easily society could overlook and forget those who existed on its margins, about how systems could fail the most vulnerable while appearing to function normally from the outside perspective. The 8 people who had sought basic shelter in the abandoned mine had been invisible before their underground ordeal. Their desperate situation had been invisible even as they called for help through tons of rock and earth. Their very humanity had been invisible to those who sealed them in darkness for the sake of profit and convenience, until a 9-year-old boy saw them and refused to let them disappear completely. In the days that followed, as sensational headlines gradually faded and national media attention drifted toward other stories, Millbrook faced uncomfortable truths about itself that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. The town had prided itself on close-knit community values and traditional neighborly care, while simultaneously allowing its most vulnerable members to fall through the cracks of social services and public awareness. It had prioritized economic development and tourism revenue over basic human safety. It had failed Jenny Morrison not just once, but repeatedly throughout her short, difficult life. These realizations were painful, but absolutely necessary for any genuine healing to begin. The wound had to be fully exposed and examined, not just the immediate tragedy of the mine collapse, but the deeper social failures and systemic indifference that had made such a tragedy possible in the first place. And in that painful recognition lay the seeds of real transformation and meaningful change. Spring arrived early in Millbrook that year, as if nature itself was eager to wash away the lingering shadows of the previous autumn's tragedy. By late March, the first determined daffodils pushed through the soil in the memorial garden, their bright yellow blooms bringing hope and renewal to ground that had lain dormant throughout the long, harsh winter. 8 months had passed since Marcus Williams appeared on Route 17 with 3 words that changed everything. The changes were visible everywhere in Millbrook now, some subtle and gradual, others profound and permanent. The luxury housing development on the ridge had been permanently abandoned after North Point Development Group declared bankruptcy amid multiple criminal prosecutions. The half-completed foundations were gradually being reclaimed by wildflowers and young saplings, returning slowly to their natural state. Mayor Sullivan had resigned in disgrace when investigations revealed her extensive knowledge of the falsified safety reports. 3 executives from North Point Development faced serious criminal charges, with their trial scheduled for the upcoming fall session. But the most meaningful transformations weren't documented in newspaper headlines or court proceedings. They lived in the daily fabric of the community itself, woven into the routine interactions and relationships that defined life in the small Vermont town. Sheriff Chen stood at the edge of the memorial garden, watching as Marcus carefully planted bright orange marigold seedlings along the curved stone pathway. The boy had designed the garden himself during the dark winter months. A circular space with 7 granite benches surrounding a central fountain, crafted from salvaged mining equipment recovered from the tunnels below. Jenny Morrison's name was engraved prominently on a copper plaque, along with the names of miners who had lost their lives in accidents over the decades of active operations. Water trickled musically over the polished metal surface, creating a sound of life and continuity that seemed to bring healing to everyone who heard it. "Looking really good," Chen commented as he approached the working area. "Those marigolds are going to be absolutely beautiful when they reach full bloom." Marcus smiled up at him, a genuine expression of joy that reached his eyes, something that had been rare during the difficult months immediately following the rescue. "Jenny told me yellow and orange flowers were her favorites," he explained, carefully tamping soil around a newly planted seedling. "She said they reminded her of sunshine and made her feel hopeful about better days coming." Dr. Foster joined them, carrying a clipboard and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose work was making a real difference. "The volunteers for the new shelter orientation will be here at 3 o'clock, she reminded Chen. "Are you still planning to give the opening presentation?" He nodded with conviction. Wouldn't miss it for anything. The Millbrook Emergency Shelter had officially opened in January, housed in the completely renovated eastern wing of the community center. What had begun as temporary accommodations for the mine survivors had evolved into a permanent resource, offering not just beds and meals, but comprehensive services including medical care, job training, addiction counseling, and mental health support. Dr. Foster volunteered there 4 days a week, her private practice now focused primarily on trauma recovery and community mental health. Her expertise had become invaluable not just for the original survivors, but for other community members dealing with various forms of crisis and hardship. "Margaret's running the kitchen today," Foster added with obvious affection. "Her shepherd's pie has become something of a local legend. People actually request it specifically when they're having difficult days." Margaret Holloway had never left Rose Williams's spare bedroom. The temporary arrangement had evolved naturally into a permanent household that surprised everyone with its harmony and mutual support. The two women, both widowed and both carrying their own forms of grief, had formed a friendship that complemented their individual strengths perfectly. Margaret's urban practicality and organizational skills meshed seamlessly with Rose's country wisdom and nurturing instincts. Marcus thrived under their combined care, gradually returning to the normal rhythms of childhood that had been interrupted by tragedy and premature responsibility. "How's Robert doing with the youth mentorship program?" Chen asked as they walked toward the community center together. "Absolutely remarkable," Foster replied with genuine enthusiasm. Who could have predicted he'd be such a natural teacher and mentor? The teenagers actually listened to him and seek out his advice. Robert Wilson had emerged as an unexpected community leader in the aftermath of the mine incident. His previous experience as a high school woodshop teacher, before alcoholism had cost him his job and eventually his home, had found new purpose and meaning in Millbrook. Now 8 months sober and living in one of the shelter's transitional housing units, he ran a comprehensive woodworking program for at-risk youth. The program taught practical skills while subtly imparting deeper lessons about second chances, personal responsibility, and the possibility of redemption even after serious mistakes. The other survivors had found their own individual paths toward healing and stability. 2 had successfully reunited with estranged family members who saw their faces in news coverage and reached out with offers of support and reconciliation. 1 had moved to Burlington for specialized medical treatment and vocational rehabilitation. maintaining regular contact with the Millbrook community through letters and occasional visits. Another had found meaningful employment with the Vermont State Parks Department, where his hard-earned knowledge of natural shelters and wilderness survival was proving valuable for education and safety programs. Inside the community center, preparations for the shelter volunteer orientation were proceeding smoothly. Deputy Torres, recently promoted to chief deputy, arranged chairs in precise rows, while Frank Carson helped Margaret set up an elaborate refreshment table featuring her famous shepherd's pie, alongside other homemade contributions from community members. Sheriff Torres greeted them professionally. The final report came in from the State Mine Safety Commission this morning. They've now inspected 67 abandoned mines across Vermont. 23 had completely inadequate sealing, just like the Jefferson Mine complex. Chen nodded grimly, though he felt satisfaction at the systematic progress. The governor's task force is definitely making a difference. Any evidence of active habitation found. 5 sites showed clear signs that people had been using the mines for shelter recently, Torres reported. No one currently trapped, thankfully, but obvious evidence that vulnerable individuals are still seeking refuge in these dangerous locations when they have nowhere else to turn. The statewide investigation that had begun with Millbrook's tragedy was revealing similar patterns across Vermont and eventually into neighboring states. Forgotten tunnel systems, inadequate safety measures, and vulnerable populations seeking basic survival shelter in potentially deadly conditions. Chen's role on the governor's task force had expanded from consultant to full co-chair. His first-hand experience proving invaluable in developing new safety protocols and emergency response procedures. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it felt like the most important thing he had ever done in his law enforcement career. Dr. Foster excused herself to respond to a situation developing in the shelter area. A new arrival was experiencing what appeared to be a severe anxiety episode, his fear and disorientation making it impossible for staff members to approach safely. She found a middle-aged man sitting rigidly in a corner of the intake area, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see, his breathing rapid and shallow with panic. She knelt at a non-threatening distance, her voice calm and measured as she guided him slowly back to present reality and safety. These crisis episodes had become less frequent as the months passed, and word spread through the transient community that Millbrook offered genuine help rather than just temporary band-aid solutions. But trauma cast long, persistent shadows that could emerge unexpectedly, even in safe environments. Outside, Rose Williams arrived with a large tray of her famous apple cinnamon muffins, pausing to watch Marcus as he continued his patient work in the memorial garden. Sometimes she still marveled at the contradiction. How her quiet, somewhat introverted grandson had found such extraordinary courage when it was needed most. The national media had dubbed him the Mine Angel, a nickname he found deeply embarrassing, but which captured something essential about his character and actions. The attention had been overwhelming at first, but it had gradually faded as other stories captured public imagination. "He's looking so much better," Sheriff Chen observed, joining Rose near the garden's entrance. "More like a normal kid again, instead of carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." Rose smiled with maternal pride and relief. Sarah says he's healing remarkably well. The nightmares are much less frequent now, and he's starting to talk about normal kid things again. Baseball, video games, whether he wants to join the school science club. She adjusted her light sweater against the cool spring breeze. Though I don't think he'll ever be quite the same person he was before all this happened. How could he be, after everything he's experienced and witnessed? None of us are exactly the same, Chen replied thoughtfully, his gaze drifting toward the distant hills where the mine entrances had been properly sealed at last. Each location marked with commemorative plaques honoring both the miners who had worked there and the more recent tragedy that had brought hidden dangers to light. Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe some kinds of change, even painful ones, make us better people in the long run. The sound of children's laughter drew their attention back to the garden, where several of Marcus's classmates had joined him in the planting work. They collaborated with the natural cooperation of youth, passing tools and sharing watering cans. Occasional disagreements resolved as quickly as they arose through the simple justice of childhood negotiation. Among the group was Sofia Martinez, whose family had been among the first to volunteer their home when the emergency shelter exceeded capacity during the coldest nights of winter. The Martinez family's generosity had inspired others to open their doors, creating an informal network of community support that extended far beyond official programs. As the afternoon sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the memorial garden, Marcus stood back to admire their collective work. The circle of granite benches, the gently burbling fountain, the carefully planted flowers just beginning to show their promise of summer beauty. It was becoming something genuinely beautiful, something healing, something that acknowledged profound pain while insisting on life's continuation and the possibility of hope. "Time for muffins and hot chocolate," Rose called out, and the children ran eagerly toward the community center, their gardening temporarily forgotten in favor of warm treats and the comfortable social chaos of friendship. Marcus lingered for just a moment longer, his small hand resting gently on Jenny's memorial plaque. "We remember you," he whispered, a private ritual he performed each time he visited the garden. "We remember your courage, and we remember that your life mattered." Then he turned and ran to join the others, his steps lighter and more carefree with each passing day. In the heart of Millbrook, deep wounds were slowly transforming into permanent scars. Still visible, still tender when pressed, but no longer actively bleeding or infected. The town that had nearly forgotten its most vulnerable members now held their stories at its very center, woven permanently into its understanding of itself and its responsibilities to others. They had learned at a terrible and unforgettable cost that a community's true character is measured not by its economic achievements or its outward prosperity, but by how it treats those who are most easily overlooked and forgotten, by who it remembers when others would prefer to look away, by who it continues to search for when they are lost in darkness, literal or metaphorical. In the quiet moments between dusk and full darkness, when memories surface like old photographs discovered in forgotten boxes, we recognize a truth that Millbrook discovered through heartbreak and redemption. No human being should ever be invisible to their community. Remember when neighborhoods knew every resident's story, when people looked out for one another not out of legal obligation, but because caring for others was simply the right thing to do. somewhere along our increasingly busy and disconnected paths. We have allowed too many people to slip through the cracks of awareness and concern. The homeless veteran standing quietly on the street corner, hoping someone will notice his need. The elderly neighbor whose name we have never learned, living in isolation just a few doors away. The troubled teenager we dismiss as someone else's problem, rather than a young person deserving guidance and support. But Marcus Williams, at just 9 years old, reminds us of what we once knew instinctively, that every single life holds immeasurable value, that genuine courage isn't about grand gestures, but about daily persistence in doing what's right, and that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected and unlikely sources. As we stand at this crossroads in our own lives, with decades of accumulated wisdom behind us and meaningful purpose still ahead, let us reclaim the lost art of truly seeing one another with compassion and commitment. Let us be the ones who notice when someone is struggling, who remember the forgotten, who continue searching even when darkness falls and hope seems distant. Because in the end, our lasting legacy isn't measured by what we build for ourselves or what material possessions we accumulate, but by whose life we touched meaningfully when they needed it most, by whose burden we helped carry when they couldn't manage alone, by whose voice we amplified when the world preferred not to listen. The cathedral chamber beneath Millbrook has been permanently sealed, but its lesson echoes on. In darkness, we discover who we truly are. And in choosing to bring light to others, we find our own path home. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.